Welcome to Voice of the People podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Dixon. And as always, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to listen to what I have to say. I truly appreciate it. If you like the content, by all means, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification button as well, so when new content drops, you'll get a heads up. If you happen to hear cars driving in the background, those are not sound effects. Those are actual cars driving by in the background. I like to do my podcast audio outside. Now, today's show is entitled NASCAR, the Confederate Flag Scapegoat. The reason why I chose that title is I feel that the real flag that NASCAR should have gotten rid of is the checkered flag. The black and white flag, to me, that still represents the racism that continues to exist within the NASCAR circuit. Now, there was a story behind the story that did not come out, and that's what I want to concentrate on today. Now, a lot of the news with NASCAR and Bubba Wallace, it was sensationalized, and now we're to the point where it's out of the news. So bear with me on some of the material that I'm going to go over. It's going to be things that you've heard before in the news, but I have to establish a lot of these things in order to get to the story within the story, like I said, that no one really saw. Now, first up, on Monday, June 22nd, 39 NASCAR drivers and their crews pushed Bubba Wallace's car to the front of the Talladega Superspeedway's field as a show of support for the circuit's only black driver. You know, I heard it described as being one of the greatest moments in the history of sports. I heard grown men was crying and babies was changing their own diapers and cats was chasing dogs around. You know, you had all of these drivers showing solidarity for Bubba Wallace and everything that he was going through with the noose being found in his garage. And, you know, everybody was tweeting about becoming a NASCAR fan. When is the next race? NASCAR's ratings for that race went through the roof. Now, in 2016, there was a company who attempted to do an interview with some NASCAR drivers, and they asked them how they felt about the Confederate flag. Only one driver chose to comment, and that one driver said, "I just know what I personally think, and I personally think these fans that have the Confederate flag, they don't come to the racetrack. I'm a racist. I hate this. I'm going to carry this flag. They don't even think of that at all." It's funny how from 2016 to 2020, how now all of a sudden these same racers who wouldn't comment on the flag, now they're behind Bubba Wallace and they're understanding now that Black Lives Matter. Well, Bubba Wallace tweeted Sunday that the despicable act of racism, and he's speaking of the noose that was found in his garage. He said, "The despicable act of racism and hatred leaves me incredibly saddened and serves as a painful reminder of how much further we have to go as a society and how persistent we must be in the fight against racism." That's what I call a blanket statement. He covered everything up, didn't expose anything. There was no mention of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Atiana Jefferson, Stephen Clark, Robert Fuller. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. Bubba Wallace could have used his platform, to bring national attention to the victims of racial injustice at the hands of law enforcement officers. But he chose not to offend racism with his watered-down narrative of how persistent we must be in our fight against racism. Bubba Wallace, tell us something that we don't know. You know, that's not even the story behind the story, but that angered me. You know, Bubba Wallace had the car painted with Black Lives Matter, and, you know, he was in the forefront of his fight against the Confederate flag. And what was going on in the world, it reached beyond NASCAR. And he had an opportunity, as I said, to bring that to the forefront and chose not to say anything. Now, NASCAR was founded by William France Sr. on February 21st, 1948. That's 72 years. Only 7 African-American drivers are known to at least start a race in the NASCAR Cup Series. Elias Bowie, George Wiltshire, Charlie Scott, Randy Bethea, Willie T. Ribbs. Now, speaking of Willie T. Ribbs, Netflix has a documentary about his life. It's out right now. It's called Uppity. I have not watched it as of yet. I am, and I recommend it to my listeners to check that video out with the things that transpired with NASCAR, the Confederate flag, and Bubba Wallace. The video began to pick up steam. The remaining other drivers are Bill Lester and, of course, Bubba Wallace. Now, Wendell Scott was the first African-American NASCAR driver. Now, there were 7 other African-American drivers who did not compete in the Cup Series, but they drove at NASCAR-sponsored events. Morty Buckles, Mark Davis, Bobby Nortfleet, and his daughter Tia Nortfleet, who was the first female African-American driver. Chase Austin, Ryan Gifford, and George Mack. Now, the NASCAR Cup Series started in 1949, and a majority of its races were held in the South. This is where the legacy of Southern racism and NASCAR began its roots. Now, I'm going to take you there to the University of Alabama, June 11th, 1963. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, in his attempt to keep his inaugural promise of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, he went to the college and he blocked the auditorium door of the entry of the African-American students. Now, when he made that statement of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, he said that in a televised speech, okay? And a lot of people, depending upon their age, may not know the background behind George Wallace, but I found it very interesting that in Forrest Gump, to me, that movie was a historical documentary. But there was a scene in there where the National Guard was at the school and you could see the young ladies trying to go into the auditorium, and, Forrest Gump happened to be at the door and opened it and let them in. But George Wallace, the governor, didn't go in office that day, went right on down to the school to try to shut that down. Now, Governor George Wallace wanted a super speedway in Alabama. He proposed a plan that NASCAR could have the Talladega airstrip and build a track there. Now, Governor Wallace, being who he was able to avoid a lot of government red tape. So the track was built fairly quickly and, literally hassle-free. The ease of construction between NASCAR and Alabama, it went so smoothly that soon after William France endorsed George Wallace for president. Now, let me say this. When you endorse a man for president, you're not endorsing a man for president because you need money for a speedway. You endorse a man for president because you fully agree and you back his mindset, his temperament, his thoughts. You are behind what he says and what he does 100%. And Governor Wallace, he made no bones about it, about who he was. It was not a secret. In 1968, before the start of the Southern 500, Bill France told the crowd, George Washington founded this country and George Wallace will save it. What was he implying? What was George Wallace going to save the country from? You got to figure 1968, 1967, you had Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. African Americans were trying to fight for civil rights. So he was implying that George Wallace was going to save America from African Americans seeking equality. Now, after losing the presidential election to Richard Nixon, George Wallace returned to Alabama to prepare to run for governor. Wallace and friends continued to use NASCAR and the Talladega Speedway as a campaign platform. 1971, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company became a title sponsor for NASCAR. Reynolds Tobacco was based out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and was the second largest tobacco company in the U.S. Hardin Reynolds, who was R.J.'s father, owned 24 properties consisting of about 8,000 acres in Patrick County, Virginia, another 3,000 acres in nearby Stokes County. His 59 slaves made him one of the largest slaveholders in that area of Virginia. The Reynolds family agricultural financial success is 100% due to free labor provided by African American slaves in the planting, harvesting, and processing of tobacco for the Reynolds plantation. When I was doing that research, it referred to the land as the Reynolds estate. And I'm like, if you're white and you own property, and on that property live slaves, and if those slaves aren't allowed to leave, and if those slaves provide a service for you for free, that, my friend, is a plantation. Now, we as African Americans might not know about a lot about the racist history of NASCAR. We might not know about R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. But I'm going to tell you something we do know about. We know about Reynolds Wrap, because we the first ones to wrap up a plate in some foil and take it home. Reynolds Wrap is founded by this same Reynolds family. We are approaching, I would say, about 12 minutes into the show. I'm trying to keep the podcast around 15 minutes because I understand a lot of us have short attention spans. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to wrap it up for now, and we will come back with a part 2, and it may possibly be a 3-part series on this subject. So again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out to listen. I greatly appreciate the support. And as always, as I've said before, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification so when the next show comes out, you will know. So from here on, I need for everybody to be safe, wear a mask, wash your hands. Until next time, take care.